Today we're going to talk about the nuclear arms race. So while I read your intro today, you're going to notice that the years in the top right corner, the United States and its testing are here, and then you'll see when the Soviets join. Okay, so these are the number of times that we test nuclear weapons and the years over here. Writer Annie Dillard was one of thousands of children who grew up in the 1950s with the chilling knowledge that nuclear war could obliterate their world in an instant. Annie recalls practicing what to do in case of a nuclear attack. At school, we had air raid drills. We took the drills really seriously. Surely Pittsburgh, which had the nation's steel, coke, and aluminum, would be one of the enemy's targets. When the air raid siren sounded, our teachers stopped talking, led us to the school basement. There the gym teachers lined us up against the cement walls and the steel lockers, showed us how to lean in and fold our arms over our heads. The teachers stood in the middle of the room, not talking to each other, with a worried look on their face. We tucked against the walls in the lockers and folded our skinny arms over our heads, raising to the enemy a clatter of gold bangle bracelets. The fear of a nuclear attack was the direct result of the Cold War. After the Soviet Union developed its atomic bomb, the two superpowers embarked on an arms race that enormously increased both the number and the destructive power of these weapons. I'm going to fast forward just a little bit. By 1962, you can see things have really picked up. Mid-1960s, lots of testing in Nevada. The mid-1970s, you can see France and Britain have joined the fray. The 1980s, we're still testing. In fact, today you're going to see video of atmospheric testing, which is dangerous. We did underwater testing, above ground testing. Even into the mid-1990s, countries are still testing. Two nations live on the edge. So this is just to give you a sense of some of the most frequently tested spots in the world. The Soviets' most frequent spot was in Kazakhstan with 496. And the United States' most popular testing location was Nevada, just outside of the Las Vegas area, 935 times. There's still significant nuclear warhead storage in Nevada today if you actually take a road trip through the Nevada area. Just to give you a sense of some of the weapons that you're going to see on videotape today, one of the reasons I put it up here. So in comparison to the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima, which you know kind of the death toll and you've seen the damage that was created there, the thermonuclear weapons that you'll see are 8 to 40 times more powerful than that. A 20 megaton bomb is equivalent to 1,500 of these types of atomic bombs. And the Soviets test something called Tsar Bomba, which is the largest nuclear test ever, 58 megaton fusion weapon. Unbelievably powerful. Although air raid drills were not common until the Eisenhower years, which is 1953 to 1961, the nuclear arms race began right after World War II with the Truman presidency, when the Soviet Union exploded its first atomic bomb in 1949, which is 2.5 years after the United States used it on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. President Truman had to make a terrible decision whether to develop an even more powerful bomb than that. Scientists who developed the atomic bomb had suspected since 1942 that it was actually possible to create an even more destructive thermonuclear weapon, a hydrogen bomb or an H-bomb. They estimated that such a bomb would have the force of 1 million tons of TNT, 67 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. But they argued vehemently about the morality of creating such a destructive weapon. Despite the concerns, the United States entered into a deadly race with the Soviet Union to see which country would be the first to produce it, and on November 1st of 1952, the United States won the race when it exploded the very first hydrogen bomb. The American advantage lasted less than a year. In August of 1953, the Soviets exploded their own thermonuclear weapon. By the time both countries had the hydrogen bomb, Dwight Eisenhower was president, and his Secretary of State, his name was John Foster Dulles. He was staunchly anti-communist, and for Dulles, the Cold War was a moral crusade against communism. Dulles proposed that the United States could prevent the spread of communism by promising to use all of its force, including its nuclear weapons, against any aggressor nation. The willingness of the United States under President Eisenhower to go to the edge of all-out war became known as brinkmanship. It's also in some texts known as the massive retaliation policy. Under this policy, the United States trimmed its Army and Navy and expanded its Air Force, which would deliver the bombs, and its buildup of nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union soon followed suit. For the next 30 years, fear of nuclear war became an absolute constant in American and Soviet life.
August 9th, 1945. The Nagasaki nuclear explosion. August 6th, 1945. The Hiroshima nuclear explosion. Since these World War II attacks, nuclear weapons have become even more powerful. The Hiroshima bomb produced an explosion of 15 kilotons. 1 kiloton equals the explosive power of 1,000 tons of TNT. If it was detonated in New York City's Times Square, this is what it would look like. The radius of the affected area would be almost a mile long. This yellow circle indicates the radius of the explosion's fireball. Within the red circle, fatalities are near 100%, and all concrete structures are damaged or demolished. Within the gray circle, most residential structures are destroyed, and there are massive injuries and fatalities. The orange circle indicates the area in which third-degree radiation burns occur. But the sheer destructive power of that explosion pales in comparison to the largest thermonuclear weapon currently in the United States arsenal, the B-83. Created in the late 1970s, the B-83 can produce an explosion of up to 1,200 kilotons, which is 80 times the Hiroshima explosion. That's the explosive power of 1.2 million tons of TNT. If dropped on New York City, the radius of the affected area would be over 7 miles. Then, there's the 1954 Operation Castle Bravo, the largest nuclear bomb ever tested by the United States. It produced a 15,000 kiloton explosion, which is over 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. If detonated in New York City, the radius of the affected area would be over 21 miles. But there's even one more powerful than that. On October 30th, 1961, the Soviet Union tested the Tsar Bomba. It is the most powerful weapon ever detonated. It produced a 50,000 kiloton explosion. That's 3,300 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. The mushroom cloud was so tall that it dwarfed anything on Earth. If dropped on New York City, the radius of the affected area would be over 31 miles. The Tsar Bomba was created over 5 decades ago. Today, there are an estimated 14,900 nuclear weapons in the world. If not for the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, we might have even more powerful bombs today.
During the 1950s, there was something called the Suez Canal Crisis. The Suez Canal Crisis included Egypt and Egypt's fight over who should develop and pay for a dam that they wanted to have built along the Aswan River. At the end of the day, Egypt was kind of playing the United States and playing the Russians at the same time, and they drew the Soviets in to this conflict. And that conflict led to the United States having this growing desire to be having like a stage in the Middle East. And that led to something called the Eisenhower Doctrine. So the Soviet Union's prestige in the Middle East rose because of its support of Egypt during the Suez Canal crisis. To counterbalance this development, President Eisenhower issued a warning in January of 1957. This warning became known as the Eisenhower Doctrine, and it said that the United States would defend the Middle East against any attack by any communist country. In March, Congress officially approved the doctrine. Simply put, it meant that the United States was publicly stating its interest in being involved in the Middle East. And in part, this has to do with, in the 1950s, the United States using the Defensive Highway Act to spend military money to build a federal highway system in the United States to allow for mobilization of troops from one border to the other quickly and efficiently. But another thing it did is it built an infrastructure up for the automobile. And so in the 1950s, you see this massive consumer explosion in automobiles and all sorts of industries around it, which meant there was an increased appetite for oil. And the Middle East had a supply of oil. That became extremely important to our economy, and to this day the United States maintains strategic interest in the Middle East, and we've been involved in many, many wars in the Middle East as a result. And it uses as its justification the Eisenhower Doctrine. This is Eisenhower, Dwight, Ike, most people called him Ike, and his wife. And the last thing we're going to talk about today is the Cold War taking to the skies. After Stalin's death in 1953, the Soviet Union had no well-defined way for one leader to succeed another, and for the first few years, a group of leaders shared power. As time went by, one man gained power, and that man's name was Nikita Khrushchev. He is going to be the Soviet leader when the space race starts. So like Stalin, Khrushchev believed that communism would take over the world, but Khrushchev thought it could be triumphed peacefully. He favored a policy of peaceful coexistence in which the two powers would compete economically and scientifically. So, that came about to lead us toward a space race. In the competition for international prestige, the Soviets leaped to an early lead in what became known as the space race. On October 4th of 1957, they launched something called Sputnik. The world's very first artificial satellite, Sputnik, traveled around the Earth at 18,000 miles per hour, circling the globe every 96 minutes. Its launch was a triumph of Soviet technology. Americans were shocked at being beaten and promptly poured money into their own space program. Trying to catch up, the United scientists worked frantically. The first attempt at an American satellite launch was a humiliating failure, with a rocket toppling to the ground. However, on January 31st of 1958, the United States successfully launched its first satellite. This is Nikita Khrushchev on the bottom left.
To infinity and beyond.
And in our early years during the space race, the United States and the Soviets tested all kinds of animals in space. They tested a dog named Laika. There was a French cat named Felix, which became a stamp. I think this is Laika and Strika. No, Bilka and Strelka. And Ham the chimp. All sorts of animals in space.
On May 30th, 2 NASA astronauts climbed inside a space capsule and launched on top of a rocket, en route to the International Space